Dragon Heist is an exciting new adventure that takes you to the streets of Waterdeep, where dungeon masters have more freedom and players will have lots of opportunities to roleplay. I talked to Chris Perkins and Mike Merles about this new adventure.
It is an urban adventure. It's a romp through the city of Waterdeep in search of a lost and rather gargantuan treasure that the villains are after. And the character's primary job is to keep the treasure out of the villains' hands, hence the heist. Now, in Waterdeep, a dragon is a gold coin. So Waterdeep Dragon Heist is about getting the gold, keeping it out of the villains' hands.
One of the ideas that Chris played with was this idea that the adventure is configurable by the dungeon master. That depending on what time of year it is, that can influence the villain that you're locking horns with, which will then alter the story that you're telling.
Each villain has plans to spend that gold in terrible ways. And every villain's need for the gold is different, and the pressure that they feel in getting it is also different. And I don't want to spoil too much what their individual agendas are, but suffice to say, if they get the gold, and there's a lot of it, bad things will ensue.
I like this concept we explore of Waterdeep as being the sort of capital of Faerun. And what that means. So it's not just that Waterdeep is the largest city, it's the most advanced city. It's the city where this is the center of culture, of the arts, of learning. I like that idea because I lived in New York City for a few years, and I really liked living there in part because there was a sense that any national trend would start in New York, or you could trace its roots there.
It is sort of the city on the cutting edge. It's kind of between a medieval city, Waterdeep, and a Victorian city. And there's magic galore, lots of magical activity in the city, lots of powerful magical figures hanging out in the city and powerful figures in general. The city has, 9 different wards, each of them as big as a town. So having an adventure which sort of swept the characters through different parts of the city was kind of an interesting challenge.
Richard Witters, one of our art directors, talks about how you have this real sense in D&D of as you're off in the periphery of the realm, in the wild. You have this very utilitarian, very primitive technology. But as you come closer and closer to the core, to a city like Waterdeep, you get more and more civilized, more advanced everyday items that people are dealing with. This idea that in Waterdeep you can catch a taxi, things like that. It feels almost like if the fringes of the civilized realms of the Sword Coast are kind of like this Dark Ages, rough and tumble, barbaric frontier, Waterdeep is almost like 1800s, London or something like that. It's a little more advanced than you might expect.
It's in some ways, from the player's perspective, it's a very fish out of water story, because everything all your skills and things as an adventurer lend themselves to the forlorn dungeon out in the wilderness where you kind of have free reign to throw your fireballs around and things like that. Within a city structure, you've got to behave differently. It changes the way your group functions. And I think that's going to be an interesting challenge, particularly for characters like barbarians and rangers, who a lot of their skills are sort of meant to play outside of the urban environment. But I think the fish out of water story has charm, and a lot of funny things will happen in a lot of games because the barbarian feels so out of place. That's not to say the barbarian's going to be useless. We try in the adventure to make sure that there's something to appeal to everybody. But I'm not lying when I say that you can't just pick a fight on the streets of Waterdeep and expect to get away with it.
Neverwinter is still kind of pulling itself out from the cataclysms it's endured. On the Moonsea Flan is like the city that's been razed and destroyed so many times. It's still this real hotbed of classic D&D dungeon adventures. There are monsters lurking everywhere. The Waterdeep is kind of where everything is starting to calm down and starting to hit more just a workaday, civilized existence that that adventurers can really disrupt. And it's a nice pairing with this idea of a heist where you can't just kick in the door and kill everything, because that doesn't quite work in the middle of a city.
Because of the limitation, you can possibly see a lot more role-playing opportunities. In fact, even if you have some players who are not necessarily role-playing minded,
right,
they're now forced into a situation where they have to figure out and address challenges verbally.
Yes. Or if they want to be violent, they have to be smart about it. They have to take the fight off the street. They have to corner their opponents in places where they're not going to get caught by the local guard and arrested. One of the other interesting things about Dragon Heist is because we are building it in Waterdeep, it does take place in Waterdeep, we had to explore things like what is the legal code of Waterdeep? What are the crimes that can be committed and what are the punishments for those crimes? And I remember writing a section of the book which was basically what happens when the characters are arrested for a crime? How do you actually play that out?
It's not a city where you can just have a brawl with like swords and spells in the middle of the street and like, oh, that just happens. Like, no, the guard shows up. This is bad. People don't want, this is the heart of civilization. People don't want fights in the streets, right? They call the guard shows up and they deal with it. You know, it's not like a rough and tumble town.
During the brainstorming session, we were trying to figure out who the bad guy was. We had so many good options that when it came time to choose, I'm like, why should we? Let's just throw them all in and try to weave a story around it. And so then the idea naturally came about that it would be kind of fun to let the DM choose the villain. If we can structure the adventure in that way, that would be kind of cool because it means that you could run the adventure multiple times and not use the same villain every time. So there's a bit of replayability that's kind of built into this adventure, which we haven't had to this extent before. As far as I know, this has never been done before.
And it also means every table has a kind of distinct experience that's theirs. You know, and so that's something which, you know, Chris has been thinking about, and it's something he wanted to do within this adventure, because it felt like a really good match for in a city. There's a kind of funny thing of your enemy is part of the city. You can just walk up to them and talk to them.
The way the adventure kicks off, and I'm not spoiling anything here by saying this, is one of the first characters you meet is Volo at the Yawning Portal, and he gives you your introductory quest. And that quest, I won't tell you what it is, but I will tell you what it was designed to do, and that is to start to familiarize the characters and the players with this character of Waterdeep, the city that they're in. And so Volo's quest kind of takes them on a little mission through the city. They solve that, and if they are successful, Volo awards them with the deed to a piece of property, which has at various times been a manor house, it's been an inn, it was an orphanage, it's got a long and storied history.
It's the fun thing about Waterdeep is it's a very D&D city. You know, it is very old, right? It's layers upon layers. And I mean, you see that in real world cities, but obviously Dungeons and Dragons, the present and the past have a very different relationship in D&D than they say do in real life.
It's a big enough city that there's a lot of playroom, and every district kind of has its own feel and its own charm. So it does feel like many locations in one place. It's also got an underground, so some of the adventure will take place there as well. So there are dungeon-like environments that you'll stumble across, but then you can always just come back up to the top of the city.
The city of 1,000 stories, right? Things like that. There's so many people in this small area and all these stories intertwined.
The villains are very, very powerful, much more powerful than the characters. The goal of the adventure is to deny them the gold and thus thwart them, but the characters are going to be very hard-pressed to actually defeat them in combat. It's possible. Maybe lucky rolls will weigh heavily in the favor of the characters and they'll emerge victorious, but these villains normally you would not mess with. They're very scary, particularly given the levels of play involved. We don't expect you to actually kill them off.
Which are some of my favorite adventures.
Yeah.
Yeah, the villain you will never have a chance to kill, but
you may. We'll give you lots of chances to kill the villain. We do not try to recommend it.
Thank you, Mike Merles and Chris Perkins, for telling us more about Dragon Heist. You can order that book on dndbeyond.com. We are the official digital toolset for 5th edition D&D. I'm Todd Kenrick. Thank you for watching.